I'm Rob Forsyth. Welcome to Liberalism in Question, a series of podcasts from here at the Centre for Independent Studies, examining a whole range of issues from the perspective of a classical liberal point of view, as well as challenging that point of view. In this episode, my colleague Emilie Dye will be talking with Senator James Paterson. Senator Paterson is the Liberal Senator for Victoria, Shadow Minister for Home Affairs, Shadow Minister for Cyber Security, and Shadow Cabinet Secretary. Thanks, Emilie.
I know you've done quite a bit of work on foreign interference and concerns, particularly around algorithms, social media. Can you share a bit with me about that?
We just got a very good warning from the US election about what we should fear for our own elections. It was disclosed by Microsoft that there was coordinated inauthentic behaviour organised by the Chinese Communist Party targeting several US politicians who've been critical of the Chinese government, including Senator Marco Rubio. They were creating bots on social media platforms that they don't directly control, platforms like X. And the purpose of this is to damage those candidates in the lead up to their election and hopefully impact their election. We've seen it in Canada and elsewhere in the Western world as well. And it's utterly corrosive to our democracy because these social media platforms are now the public square where the big issues get debated, where issues get resolved, where political elections are influenced. And unfortunately, Australia is dangerously vulnerable to this kind of interference impacting our own democracy and changing the legitimate choices that we make about our own future.
Yeah. Do you think with the number of social media channels that are from different countries, owned by different people, that creates some sort of balance, or do you think that the market isn't sufficient here?
Unfortunately, it's not. I'd like to think that it was, but because we have foreign authoritarian states that are adept at both using platforms headquartered in other countries. So China, for example, very effectively tries to game the algorithms of Western headquartered social media platforms by flooding it with content. But they also have social media platforms that they themselves control. And so they don't need to flood TikTok or WeChat with inauthentic content because they control the algorithm. And in a way that's not transparent to us, they can influence what everyone sees and hears on that. And the little independent research that we do have on a platform like TikTok shows that issues that are sensitive to the Chinese Communist Party are censored. You're much less likely to see content about Tiananmen Square or the genocide against the Uyghurs and other issues in China. And issues that are damaging or dividing in Western societies like Israel, Gaza, you're much more likely to see pro-Hamas content on TikTok than any other platform. And the way that TikTok has responded to this research is they've shut down the research tools that allowed people to make those observations. I think that tells you a lot about how they operate and their relationship with the Chinese government.
Yeah, I would probably support like transparency, but I do get wary when it comes to more like authoritarian responses, like we've seen in the United States, where they're forcing TikTok to sell to an American company. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the starting point is transparency. I think I led an inquiry into foreign interference through social media, and our recommendations were all about transparency, that the platforms should be transparent about their relationships with foreign governments, that should be transparent about the editorial policies and the censorship that they do, about the content that they promote and that they suppress on their platforms, and that would help a lot. But I think what the United States has done does need to be examined carefully here too, because if the Chinese government or a state-owned enterprise in China proposed buying a television network in our country or a newspaper, there is no way that we would ever agree to that. And yet TikTok, as one example, is far more influential than any single newspaper or any single television program because it is the dominant source of news and information about the world for young people. And we would never normally have agreed to allow an authoritarian government to control that source of information. So I think we do have to look at those. It's not saying that TikTok can't exist in Australia or in the United States, just that it can't be controlled by a government or a company that's beholden to an authoritarian government.
I think where I'm at is I actually controversial think that it's a good thing that TikTok is in China, and it's a good thing that they're able to like put forward stuff from like Israel, Palestine. It's different from what is being presented on the other social media platforms because it does create this competition, even if it's from a worldview that I oppose and object to. I like the fact that it exists and there's a competition there, like at least I can access different ideas.
Yeah.
How would you respond to that?
I do agree that diversity of ideas is critically important, and also freedom of speech is called what I believe as an individual. But I think we've got that diversity on other platforms. I don't think you can argue, for example, that you can't access a diversity of views on X Literally every view on the world is available on a platform like X. But we did see during the pandemic censorship on some of the Western headquartered social media platforms. I think it is good that we have a diversity of platforms so people can choose about the source of information that they get. But again, the problem with TikTok is it's not transparent. We don't know what the Chinese government is choosing to surface to our viewers and citizens, and we don't know how they're trying to influence them in elections and deciding big public policy issues in our democracy. And they would never allow us to do that to them. I'm not sure we should allow them to do it to us.
Well, they have a very authoritarian response to social media broadly, and
Correct.
I look at China and wouldn't see that as the gold standard. Like I wouldn't want to be in a country where with the Great Firewall of China.
Totally.
Even if they are very effective at managing what comes out on their social medias. I know Australia has started to move in that direction to some extent with the misinformation bill. Are you concerned about that?
Extremely concerned. I'm totally opposed to both the first and second iteration of the mis and disinformation bill because it has a philosophy of censorship, not transparency. It's not about informing people or giving them access to information. It's actually about withholding information from them and censoring the legitimately held political beliefs of Australian citizens. I mean, it basically takes the view that it should be unlawful, it is wrong to be misinformed, to have the wrong view, and that what is truth can be decided by a government agency or a social media platform. And in a free society, that's deeply disturbing. Like, it's actually not a crime to be wrong. It's not even a crime to be wrong on the internet, and you should be allowed to be wrong in a free society. And I don't trust a government agency, a social media platform, or anyone else to be the arbiter of truth, because our understanding of truth changes over time through public debate and freedom of speech. And we've seen that in the context of the pandemic. There were things that were censored during the pandemic on the basis that it was misinformation or disinformation that was subsequently proven to be true. And that's the danger of putting this trust in government authorities and others. Yeah.
What about having, like, the companies themselves? Do you support the companies being able to do censorship at all?
No, I certainly don't support the government pressuring or forcing the companies to do even more censorship than they already do. I do believe in private property rights, and if I just decide to start a newspaper, I do get to choose which letters to the editor are published in my newspaper, and I can have an editorial line and a perspective. So I think we should be careful about saying platforms must have certain content on there, but we definitely shouldn't be encouraging them to take content off their platforms, because then what you're saying is you want an American headquartered social media platform or a Chinese social media headquartered platform to decide what is in the public square in Australian political debate, and I think that's deeply uncomfortable, and the platforms have made wrong decisions in the past about content that should be removed on the basis that it was false.
Yeah, I mean, they definitely have. I mean, I do want, like, I like that there is some censorship. One of the struggles that I've had now that Elon has taken over Twitter is the level of bots has increased, the level of spam, the level of that is showing up on these platforms. So I support some censorship. I guess the question is, where do we draw that line? And is it okay that social media platforms draw that line in different places? Yeah.
Well, bots don't have freedom of speech rights. Human beings do. Individuals do. And so I jealously guard the rights of you and I to say what we want on those platforms within reason. Obviously, the main exception to freedom of speech that most free speech advocates accept is incitement to violence. That's obviously a clear, bright line, that a distinction that we can draw. But short of that, I think we should be able to freely interact on these platforms within those laws, and there's defamation and other things like that which are a constraint. But otherwise, it's up to the platforms to decide what kind of user experience they want their customers to have. And it is a user experience and it is a commercial relationship. And it's not very pleasant to be on a platform where you are bombarded with pornography or bots or propaganda from that is neo-Nazi or whatever. Like I would choose to be part of a platform that does that. And so a company that's trying to make a profit can decide that we don't want to have this content on there because it's not a good user experience, and that's legitimate.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair. When it comes to like restricting those platforms into like, it's not that the platforms are actually selecting what the content is. So TikTok's obviously not creating the content. A lot of the content, say with the Israel-Palestine conflict, is being made by Israeli soldiers or by people on the ground. They're just choosing what to promote and what to push more than others.
Yeah, so TikTok has a human-assisted algorithm. It's not an algorithm that's purely based on random data inputs. It effectively has editorial control, and they choose to surface and promote some content and suppress other content based on its own probably commercial practices, but also its relationship with the Chinese government. And that's why issues that are sensitive to China reduced on the platform. There
Yeah.
was one study that if you search for Xinjiang on TikTok, 95% of the content is positive and about how Xinjiang is a wonderful place. And a lot of that is Chinese government sponsored content that has been put on the platform and then
Yeah.
promoted by TikTok so that we receive it, in contrary to all of the international evidence from human rights groups and the UN and others that there's a possible genocide or crimes against humanity taking place there. So it is inauthentic or sponsored content that goes on there, but then the platforms, some of them, choose to surface it in a way that's favourable to the political interests of their ultimate masters.
Yeah. I mean, how is that much different than, say, like the Australian government trying to get things pushed out on these platforms and pushing them to do that?
Yeah, we don't have any mechanisms to like legal mechanisms to force them to do that. The way that the Chinese government does it is that Article 7 of the 2017 National Intelligence Law, which requires all Chinese citizens and companies to cooperate with Chinese intelligence agencies and to keep that cooperation secret. And they also have within their companies Chinese Communist Party cells, they have a strategic stake by the Chinese state. They have a relationship with their private sector that we don't have with our private sector. We have a genuinely free enterprise system. It might not be perfect, but the government doesn't direct private business in the same way that China does.
So do you think they have an incentive right now to be influencing other countries? I know that US likes to spread democracy around the world. Do you think China is in a similar position of wanting to spread communist ideology around the world?
I don't think they have a objective, as the Soviet Union did, of spreading communism around the world. They're not in sponsoring communist uprisings around the world. What they do want is they want compliance, and they want us to subsume our national interest and decisions to theirs. And so, particularly in relation to Taiwan, they're trying to make us preemptively concede that if they were to annex Taiwan by force, that there'll be nothing wrong with that, and we shouldn't object to that because, in their view, Taiwan's always been part of China and should be controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. And if we make preemptive intellectual concessions like that, then we'll allow them to make massive gains at the expense of the free world in a way I think would be hugely detrimental to Australia and not just the people of Taiwan. So there's ample evidence in the public sphere that they're doing that already and have been doing it for years.
Can you explain why we should care? I know that's very broad, but why should we care about Taiwan?
Yeah, well, I think there's a good reason to care about Taiwan because it's a fellow liberal democracy and there's 24 million people whose freedom would be extinguished if they were annexed by the Chinese Communist Party. But even if you're not moved by that appeal to empathy of the Taiwanese people, it's in our national interest not to allow this to happen because right now about 2/3 of Australia's international trade is seaborne and comes through the South China Sea and the Taiwan Straits and East China Sea. And that's okay because these are international waterways that no one power dominates or controls. But if the Chinese government were able to annex Taiwan by force, these key waterways that supply our economy would effectively become a Chinese lake and they would decide what passes through it. So the economic coercion campaign that we had from China over the last couple of years would be like a walk in the park. They would be able to hold at risk all of our international trade, not just with China and Taiwan, but Vietnam and Korea and Japan and other important partners. And we would be in an incredibly weak position to resist. They would be able to turn on or turn off the tap on key commodities like oil and fuel to our economy, our exports, in a way that would force us to make some very serious compromises. And Peter Varghese, the former Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, has said that what China seeks from Australia is a vassal state relationship where we're a nominally independent country, but our public policy decisions are made for us in China. And the list of 14 demands that they published during the economic coercion campaign very clearly set that out. They said they wanted members of parliament, media and think tanks to stop criticising China and its human rights record. We should abolish our foreign investment review and allow unrestricted foreign investment from China. We should repeal our foreign influence transparency scheme, which requires foreign governments trying to influence our democracy to be open about it. I mean, these are pretty fundamental questions about whether we're a sovereign liberal democracy. And without any kind of immediate military threat to Australia, they could have enormous influence and control over Australia, and we wouldn't be the sovereign country we are today.
So you actually think that is a risk that we could become like a vassal state of China?
If they continue on the path that they're on, and if they are not deterred from doing something incredibly reckless and dangerous in Taiwan, then yes, I think that is unfortunately a realistic prospect, and one that should kind of keep us all up at night. It's what keeps me up at night, and why I go to work every day to work on the national security problems that we face.
Yeah. And how do you think the US plays into that? And also, how will the US election impact that one way or the other, depending on who wins?
Well, American leadership is indispensable. No one other than America can deter China successfully from entering into a war over Taiwan. They need the support of their allies and friends like Japan and the Philippines and Australia to help support them in that. And collectively, I think we actually have a very good chance of deterring Xi Jinping from doing something reckless like that. But if the United States ever turns inwards, if it ever retreats, if it says that this is not our fight, that we're not interested in that, then things could change, and we could see really aggressive military expansionism from the Chinese government that would be enormously detrimental for the world, including for China, I think. And so, that American leadership is critical. The good thing about the developments in American politics over the last decade is there's an incredibly high degree of consensus about these issues. They're divided on lots of things, but they understand the fundamental challenge that the Chinese Communist Party and its authoritarian partners pose to the peaceful world order that we've had in the post-World War II era. And they know that if China's successful, we'll be living in a very different world. Our grandchildren will inherit from us a much more dangerous world. And so I think regardless of who wins the election, I think there will be high degree of consensus on that issue.
Okay, yeah. Well, that's kind of, at least that's comforting to some extent that Americans can agree on something.
Yeah.
As do we really want to be in a world where the U.S. has that much power? Like, how friendly should we be with the U.S., particularly as that democracy appears to be struggling really deeply?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of valid critiques of American leadership in the world. It's been imperfect, and Americans concede that more readily than anyone else in the world. They're more critical of their own government than even we are or other kind of partners are. But if you think that the American-led world order hasn't been perfect, wait until you see a world order that's led by an authoritarian regime that has a completely different value set to the one that the United States has. I think if there ever is an end to that American global leadership in our lifetimes, we will come to really regret ever seeing that happen, and we will come to regard it as a golden age of peace and prosperity compared to what could replace it. I mean, there's nothing ordained about the last 70 years of general peace and stability around the world, of no more global wars, of no more world wars. We could easily find ourselves in a more dangerous time of history again, as we have in the past, and I think it's much more likely if there's a vacuum of leadership from the United States.
I mean, from my perspective, I always thought it had more to do with the fact that we can't have all-out war because of the existence of nuclear weapons. Do you think that would really change?
That's a fair point. I think mutually assured destruction has been a limit on at least superpower conflict, and there've only been proxy conflicts or smaller wars or wars between countries that don't have nuclear weapons. But another part of it is that we've had an international system that has been led by a country that believes in sovereignty and self-determination and democracy, and so it doesn't seek expansionism for its own sake. It doesn't seek territory of its neighbours, and that would change if we had a change to an authoritarian system. And we're seeing it right now. We see the Russian government has the view that it should be able to take the land of its neighbours because they don't have legitimate historical claims and they have the power to do it. And there've been previous Chinese foreign ministers who basically said that same thing to their partners in the region, that we just have to accept that they're a big country and we are small countries, and therefore we have to do what they say. And so even if there wasn't global conflict, we'll be living in an environment where our sovereignty and our democracy would be severely imperiled, and it would look very different to what it does today.
Is there ways? Are there ways in which Australia can, without the assistance of the US, be really bolstering themselves and protecting against that kind of world?
If we didn't have the US, we'd be spending 3 to 5 times more than we do on defence as a percentage of GDP as we are now. The Americans' support allows us to, frankly, underinvest in defence compared to what we would in a world like that, and we're all probably richer for that. But I still think that we could do more to contribute with the United States and our allies by spending more now for a conflict that could not be that far away. I mean, our objective is to prevent that conflict through deterrence, and the only way you do that is to be credible, to have the capability to very clearly communicate your intent and to work closely with your allies. And I don't think we're doing any of that enough as we should if we want to avert what would be catastrophic war.
What makes you so confident that China would want to expand beyond Taiwan and beyond just like, okay, we got China, we're happy with our little corner of the world and our protected trade relationships?
I'm not absolutely certain it would want to expand beyond China, beyond Taiwan in terms of territorial claims. That's not clear, but it is very clear that what kind of relationship China wants with its partners. It's kind of publicly articulated that. They say it very plainly. And when dictators say things, we should take them seriously, particularly when at the same time as they're saying these things, they're acquiring the military capability that they need to do those things. China now has the largest blue water navy in the world by ships, and they soon will have the largest navy by tonnage. Countries don't acquire that for the fun of it. They acquire it because they intend to use it, and they intend to use the power that comes with it to coerce their partners. And we've been on the receiving end of that coercion campaign, but we're not the only ones who have. Tiny Lithuania was a target of a coercion campaign because They did something in relation to Taiwan that the Chinese government didn't approve. South Korea has previously been on the receiving end of it. So it's very clear what expectation they have of their trading partners, and that is in a world where their power is constrained by the United States. Imagine if it was a world where they were unconstrained by the United States. Their demands of us are not likely to become less severe. And the final point I make is that by the very nature of the regime, it's an authoritarian communist regime. It is obsessed with its own survival and control. It is insecure domestically. It cannot permit any limits or tests or checks on its power domestically. And countries which operate like that domestically also operate the same way internationally. They can't tolerate, if they have to, unless they have to, any limits on their power. And so I think we would be deeply regret a fundamental change to that power order if it happens.
Do you think we have much power through our trade and restricting trade? I know that it hasn't been the most effective with Russia and sanctions. Do we have any power in that respect?
Sanctions have limited utility in war unless it's very widely adhered to. In the case of Russia's war in Ukraine, very severe sanctions have been put on it by about a third of the world, but a big chunk of the world applied no sanctions at all or no meaningful sanctions, and so it's been very easy for Russia to evade that. And China is Russia's principal economic and financial sponsor of that war, and although there's no evidence they're providing concrete military equipment, they are providing dual-use equipment that has military applications and other critical supports for the Russian economy, without which they wouldn't be able to sustain the war. So unless you have much more stronger collective buy-in, you're not going to defeat a foe through tariffs and sanctions alone. That's why military capability and deterrence is so critical. That's the only thing that really stops a war.